Douglas, as you've written a book about it, why don't you define, for the benefit of the audience, and indeed for us here tonight, what neoconservatism actually is?
Sure. Well, it's the important thing to stress, first of all, is that it's not a party. It's not a cabal or a group. Most neocons like myself don't even know each other, we don't meet. It's simply a way of looking at the world. It's an attitude, a perspective on things. I say that one of the defining things about that is that it's a mixture of realism and idealism. Now, that may not sound so odd, but I think that in our current climate today it is very odd. On the one hand, we have a lot of conservatives, people from the right, who distrust idealism, are deeply suspicious of it and of social engineering of any kind, whether at home or abroad. And on the other hand, there are, of course, the modern-day leftists, liberals as they're called in the States, who simply refuse to see the world how it is. So it is quite rare.
Quite rare, okay. Oliver, would you agree with that assessment, or is Douglas missing something out?
I think Douglas is missing something out. There is an intellectual lineage about neoconservatism that does need to be stressed. It derives in the first place from American liberalism. It is an outgrowth of American liberalism. Its roots are in the Democratic Party, which went through terrible ructions over the experience of Vietnam. Neoconservatism largely stems from the group organized around Senator Henry Jackson, the aspirant Democratic presidential nominee in 1972 and 1976, whose foreign policy views made him highly unpalatable to a new activist strain within the Democratic Party grouped around George McGovern, the actual Democratic presidential nominee in 1972. Where we are now, I think, is that neoconservatism has grown up as a movement, but is now splintering again, which is the proper sign of a mature political movement. Neoconservatism covers more than just foreign policy. It covers a critique in domestic policy that is largely critical of what it sees as welfare state dependency and has a very well-articulated opposition to what it sees as destructive cultural trends, cultural relativism, and the loss in welfare provision of the sense of stigma. And my own position is sympathetic to neoconservatism in foreign policy, but very different from the sort of social views that are more associated with conservatism that someone like Douglas would argue for.
Yes, of course, Douglas. I did say earlier that actually it's a foreign policy element we're looking at, and I know we have a domestic side to it. You will obviously come onto a different side to Oliver on that purpose, on the domestic.
On domestic, but
yes.
The interesting thing about neoconservatism is that it's bridged the gap between left and right, as it were, and centrists in recent decades. Oliver's quite right to say it's sort of grown up recently and has splintered. I mean, in some ways, neoconservatives have always been a sort of splintered movement, if you can call them a movement. They have always, Irving Kristol, one of the founders really of neoconservative thought, said in the 60s, you know, if you put three neoconservatives in a room, the likelihood is that they're going to disagree more than they're going to agree. As I said, it backs up my notion that, I mean, apart from being a philosophy and things which you can trace, it's also just an attitude which is in some ways undefinable.
Right. Stephen, the authors have had their say. Anything to add from this?
Well, I come at it not as a neocon, but as a con, if you will, from a traditional conservative standpoint.
Yes.
And the thing that I take exception with from Douglas's definition is that the blend of realism and idealism in the latter part runs the risk often in neoconservatism of overstepping that and becoming not idealism but ideology, which is something that I, as a
very suspicious conservatives, are very suspicious
of, and particularly in foreign policy, where it's all important to be practical and